All right. Well, Stuart, since we had such a great JLive conversation the other day, people had a lot of follow-up questions. So we wanted to do a part two and dig in a little bit more with your expertise. So I have a list of questions for you here, and hopefully all of you out there who were on with us the first time will be able to see this now. So, all right, let's start here. Somebody wanted to know, what do you think or recall of your participation on the PBS program on Jews and Broadway that I think you could see on PBS occasionally? Tell us a little bit about that special and what it was it like to be involved with that?
It was fascinating. It's a funny story, really. It goes back to about 2000. You know, I mentioned, I think in the talk the other day about how I got involved doing these programs of presentations of doing scenes from different Broadway musicals, and that they had a specifically Jewish slant to them. So here I am about 2000 starting to do these. And I did them around Boston and Cape Cod and so on and so forth with different people. It was very exciting. And at the same time as that was happening, I was also starting to work in doing in my research and writing. I figured, gee, if I'm doing this for presentations in the Jewish community in Boston, maybe it's something I'm actually interested in as a scholar. So I started to do a lot of research. And my thinking was sort of along the lines of, again, this notion of kind of like assimilation in relationship to the American dream. To what degree does an immigrant of any ilk feel obliged or the desire to transform him or herself in order to become more Americanized, specifically as a necessary step to achieve acceptance and, again, the American dream, affluence and happiness and family in a house and so forth. And so I started to do presentations at scholarly conferences on those themes at the same time, which was wonderful. It was fascinating, and then I would do a program. Long story short, I got invited to do such a program in Newton, Massachusetts, and by a person I didn't know at the time, who led a group that was a chorus that basically sang musicals. And it was a club. And her name is Barbara Brilliant. And Barbara, I found out later, had a long career in Boston television. And we got along famously. The program went very well. She was very pleased. I sat at the piano and played and introduced these things in my kind of, like I say, my Leonard Bernstein way. Not that I'm a Leonard Bernstein composer, goodness sake, but going back to as a kid, seeing these Leonard Bernstein children's concerts that were telecast. And I love that notion of the way he would sort of talk about a theme. And then, of course, he had a full symphony orchestra, not too shabby, that would then let me demonstrate, and then they would play a thing and then he would talk about it. And that's kind of how I structured those things. It made a lot of sense, really, to me at least. So Barbara had invited us and I put together, again, about, 25 different numbers with themes and so on. And we had a very lovely time. And I was talking again about these kinds of issues about Jewish identity and relative acceptance and so on and so forth. And so after the program, Barbara said to me, Stuart, we should have lunch. And I said, sure, what do you want to have lunch about? I mean, it's nice to meet a new person. And she said, and so we did. And it turns out that she said that she had a long interest in putting together a documentary about Jews and Broadway. And I said, sounds great. I think it's exciting. And there hasn't been one in a long time. And go for it. It's great. And then I said to her the thing. I said, listen, I said, that's a great idea, but don't let it be just another, and then we did this kind of show. And everybody smiles and is happy. I think this material is richer than that. And it was, of course, coming from the fact of my own research and thought at the time. And so we talked about it. And I said, specifically issues about assimilation, pressures to assimilate, and the fear of acceptance or rejection as a Jew functioning within the dominant American culture. And how this was a common theme to be found in a lot of musicals. So we talked it through at the time. And then she said, well, let me work on this more and I'll get back to you. This is about, let's see, I started working on these programs and giving papers around 2000, 2001, somewhere around there. This conversation was probably about 2004. And then she contacted me. She said, Stuart, I want you to be on the board, the advisory board on this project. I said, I'm happy to do so. And, and she keeps on doing her thing and contacting people and raising money and all the things a person needs to do. And she put together this whole project. And the original director was a guy named, I think, Steve Revo, if I remember correctly. I hope that's correct. Forgive me if not. And anyway, so she's going to have interviews in town at her own home. And so and Stuart, and several people were being interviewed, amongst them me. And I went there. But before then, she's like, Stuart, send chapter. How are you doing with your book? Because at this point, I'm writing the book about it. So send the latest chapters to Steve. Literally, I mean, like literally, And so I did. I mean, I was going through old emails, actually finding all this stuff. It was funny. And I got there and was interviewed. And in the middle, Steve was like, so Stuart, in your book, you said such and such. Can you please tell us about that? And I thought, well, you just said it, Steve. What am I got to say, But it went very well, And the thing about it was, they had brought in so many different people to talk about different aspects. And I think I was the only one who was a scholar that's in the film. I might be wrong. There might be one other. But everybody else are practitioners themselves, composers and lyricists and that sort of thing. And I appreciate that, And I say, well, why was I? Well, because again, I was establishing the themes. I'll say one more thing, and that is that when it was being developed, Barbara put together a promo version to show to possible investors. It was about 10 or 15 minutes long, I don't know, and I saw it. And in this earlier version, it really was just following my thesis. I mean, about assimilation and the fears of, am I accepted in America or not? Those kinds of things. With wonderful interviews that never made it into the final version. But that's fine, And the final version came out in, I think it was January of 2013, on New Year's Day here in Boston. And it was thrilling. And then it was broadcast all over the world. And I suddenly heard from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. True, honest to goodness. And people in England and stuff, and it led to other things. It was a wonderful experience. It won a Peabody Award, which is kind of the equivalent of an Oscar, which was thrilling. And again, I think that's because it had the razzmatazz, but it also had substance, as I was trying to argue for. And I think that there's stories in there that are most poignant that wouldn't have been there if they had not been asked to talk about it. Because let's face it, most people are going to talk about, oh yes, and then I did this show and then I won this award. But only if you ask them directly are they going to talk about these more private concerns and anxieties, and also validation and reaffirmations of being a Jew functioning in America. So I'm thrilled that I had a part in it. Barbara was valiant in her efforts to get all these people together and to build it into such a marvelous film, and it's gotten a lot of play, and it's still broadcast, yes. So I'm delighted that somebody noticed and said something to say about it. And yes, I still can sing the all of George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue for you if you want me to, right here.
It's a great offer.
We got a deal.
Deal. All right, at the end. I love it. Okay, so here's a totally different question that someone else wanted to know that I also wanted to know. What is your favorite classic Broadway show or composer?
Oh, God.
It's like picking your favorite child, I know.
I know, isn't it true? It's funny, I directed a lot, and I directed a number of musicals, and of course, whatever show you're working on is your favorite at the time.
Right.
I mean, how could you not say this particular show? But of course, when you step back and you look back at it, you see different patterns or stuff like that. When I was a little kid, my parents had some LPs, not a lot, and amongst them were My Fair Lady and West Side Story, Fiddler on the Roof, these kinds of things. And so I love My Fair Lady. I don't know why in particular. West Side Story.
It's funny, Stuart. I I have an affinity also for My Fair Lady because my sister was Eliza Doolittle in high school. So that's our
No
family. That's
kidding.
our family show.
Ah, there you go. It's wonderful. It's so delightful. And
It
it
really
just
is.
plays. It plays like crazy. It was just a revival on Broadway about 2 years ago, maybe now,
Hmm.
and it was just terrific. So yeah, I hope it continues.
Yeah.
The musicals are precarious because the books, because they are of the time, and the times are constantly changing. Sometimes the material becomes dated, even if the songs are still wonderful. And sometimes they'll then do revisions of the shows to update them and so on and so forth. My Fair Lady, though, still works, even though, of course, this revival happened right in the middle of the Me Too movement. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. And of course, they portrayed it on Broadway at the Lincoln Center as a very strong woman at the end, not someone who just caters to Higgins at the end, but they made her strong in the presentation, the way the director worked. So again, isn't that interesting about theater as well? So I love My Fair Lady, but amongst other shows, I scribbled down some thoughts in general. I think Showboat is the most important, but also maybe the best musical ever made for a gazillion reasons, which I'm happy to comment on. A couple others, I adore Candide, which I mentioned last time I directed. The 1974 version, though, which was sort of conceived and put together by Hal Prince, with new songs or new lyrics by Stephen Sondheim at that time. I also have an affinity for Stephen Sondheim's show, A Little Night Music. It just haunts me. I just think it's the most beautiful thing. And maybe it's because my background, I said last time, my background is a combination of sort of American jazz and pop and rock and all that stuff on one side, but also classical music on the other. And I think that show really is a it's European on the outside, but it's American on the inside. And it just haunts me. I really love it. And I love the score to that very, very much. But of all the shows I directed, Candide was the most fun. I had 28 actors doing 93 roles with ramps all through the audience. And the actors basically needed, tennis shoes to get from one place to the next because they were always having to change. Each person played something like 5 different characters.
Wow.
While at the same time playing this very challenging operatic Leonard Bernstein music. It was a hoot and a holler, and it's social commentary. And I think that's part of it too. Yes, it's Voltaire, but it's also, I think, dare I say, Jewish in many respects because of that, with the use of humor, to make commentary about the world and its ironies. So yay, musicals.
I love that. Okay, so this is a little bit of a departure, but in the same vein. And I admit I feel ignorant right now. I did not know that the great Molly Pecan was from Boston, apparently. Yeah. And someone has asked, have you ever thought about doing anything about her life?
It's funny. She's fascinating, isn't she? I read her biography. I read her biography maybe about 5 years ago, and it's very dry. And I was, because really she was a very serious businesswoman. And she married this guy who was very boring, but was very stable and really looked after her. He took care of her and really promoted her. He's really the person that pushed her forward to become a star, Wow. And she herself, when she was young, she did, was it like Yiddle with the Fiddle and all this sort of stuff, these wonderful old shows. And Yiddish shows. She was the great star of the Yiddish theater, and she was younger than most everybody else, and that's part of the story too. The Yiddish theater by the end of the 30s really died, not completely, but insofar as, in the 1910s and 20s, if you're in New York and you go to Second Avenue, whole families would show up to the theater all day long with the kids running around like crazy, making a ruckus, attending the shows. And the Jews love their Yiddish theater, and which is interesting because it really didn't happen until America. It started in Hungary and stuff like that, but only a few years prior to New York. It's not like it's an old form, really. What's his name? Abraham oh God, someone's gonna yell at me now. Goldenfather, is that right? Goldfather. Oh goodness. But it's like 1860s or something. He really business credit with inventing the form. It doesn't go back that far. But you're the great stars. And part of the reason was because of movies and television, because of assimilation. You have the great stars like oh God, I don't know. Let's take Joseph Adler, one of the great tragic romantic stars of the Yiddish theater in New York and Adler's theater, you know. And he was a sex symbol. And when he died, there were miles of mourners after, you know, down Second Avenue and so on and so forth. If you think about it, he has two kids who went into show business, Stella and, oh goodness, I'm blanking on his name. This is so stupid. Someone's going to know this too. If we were live, I would ask somebody out there to tell me. But they both became.
Phone a friend.
I know, it's true, isn't it? But they were both part of the group theater in the 1930s, which revolutionized American theater. And that's part of the story. You know, the parents were old world in old country, but the next generation wanted to be Americanized. And so the kids had these Yiddish roots, but the kind of theater they wanted to do was American and modern. And it was also influenced by Stanislavski in Russia, but with the Yiddish theater there, you know, which was very avant-garde and modern. Look at the Gershwins. As little kids, they go to the Yiddish theater, and the melodies are built into George's songs. You can hear them. But what did he write himself? He didn't write Yiddish stuff. He wrote American stuff, or maybe African-American sounding stuff, which was all a blend, because he would go to these all-night parties in Harlem with people like Willie the Lion Smith, who was a black man who was actually Jewish, and play all night playing stride piano in jazz and blues in the black neighborhoods. They're all influencing each other, but he didn't go back. You know, it's not like he suddenly then grew a beard and wore a yarmulke. I mean, he was very much an American. So that's a big part of the story, the Americanization process, which, you know, like, and this is not limited to Jews. This is almost all nationalities. The kids, especially on the street, want to become accepted, and they don't want to be greenhorns, and they want to make it in America. They want to be popular and have friends, and they don't want to be pointed out as being weird or whatever. And they become Americanized, you know. And then it's a battle as to what degree they preserve their Jewish or other traditions or not. And of course, it's a case-by-case basis. So Molly is like the next generation. So that she's really, yes, 20s and 30s, but she continues on into the 1960s and 70s performing. And, you know, in 1961, I think it was, Jerry Herman, the person who later did Hello, Dolly and Mame, his first hit show was called Milk and Honey. And it was on Broadway. And it's very interesting because 1961, it's a Jewish show. Who heard of a Jewish show on Broadway? It's not until the around 1960, the same impulse that led to like the Kennedy administration, you know, his nomination, his victory as president, administration, that you really start to see ethnicity. You start to see dribs and drabs in the early 50s. You know, if you see something like On the Town on film, you say, oh, there's On the Town, you know, New York, a hell of a town. The Bronx is up and the Battery's down. The people riding a hole around New York. Yeah, it's wonderful. And you sit there and you go, well, that's really a Jerome Robbins Bernstein show. But, you know, what's fascinating is the film is, well, who's in the film? Well, you think, okay, well, the film, let's see. Oh, yeah, well, there's Frank Sinatra and there's Gene Kelly and there's the other guy. Again, I'm so bad, forgive me. But he's Jewish. You know, this is 1950. And you're going, well, so what's the big deal? Well, the original Broadway show, 1942, even had Black people in the chorus. It was unheard of. But Bernstein and Robbins and stuff wanted to say, no, this is America, but also let's have that diversity. We talk about it now, it goes way back. This is unheard of. And, you know, and it was shocking. What do you mean you have ethnic types as the leads in 1950? And then, of course, closer to 60, you get Brando and Kirk Douglas and all these kinds of, you know, Tony Curtis, whatever, more ethnic leading men and stuff. But on Broadway, no, not really, until you get to Milk and Honey. And it's about Israel. And it starred Molly Pecan. It was about some American Jewish women who go to Israel and they're in search of love. And they find, and of course it's a celebration. It's a postcard for this new country. And that's what it was. But it was unheard of. It was groundbreaking. And within a couple of years, you then have Fiddler on the Roof and Funny Girl. And suddenly you have Jews as protagonists, as romantic leads. Instead of it being about Jews fitting into the American life, oh, welcome. Oh, you can stand over there, Jewish person, but you're part of us, our community. Suddenly they are the community. So it's a huge shift and a huge transition. So Molly, sweet Molly Pecan or Molly Pecan, whatever I always heard Pecan, was part of that. And she really was. It's kind of like, well, like in Oklahoma, the original Oklahoma, there's the peddler, Ali Hakim, who's supposed to be Persian, but they cast Joseph Buloff in the role, who was the star of the Yiddish theater. So the Broadway audience go on that saying, oh yeah, he says he's Persian, but we know who he really is, And that's true, because all these composers were Jews. And that was their vision of America. Just like in the movies, they small town America, like the Andy Hardy movies, that wasn't a reality. That was invented by Jewish producers. It was an idealized American community, small town. Oh, but what about like It's a Wonderful Life? There's no Jews. There's true, but it was directed by and written by a guy who was Italian. How many Italians are in small town America, folks? It's very much, here's our vision of inclusivity. So Molly, bless her heart, I don't know if her life would make a good musical if you were real. Now, if we're going back to those 30s musicals, you can pretty much write whatever you want. Sure, why not? But we already got Fanny Brice and Barbra Streisand, so I think we're okay. But lovely question, and it's nice to linger with her.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so since you mentioned TV, there was a question: have you watched Schmigadoon?
I came across it as a trailer, and I'm like going, I don't know, maybe on Facebook, I don't know what it was. And I was like, excuse me, I didn't have anything to drink. I mean, like blink, blink, what am I watching here, And it was just surreal. I mean, it was kind of like what Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, kind of cartoony, bright, bold colors and all these people smiling and laughing and all this, And I just was sort of stunned at first, like going, like the audience, and if you ever saw the producers, so the first time they see the Springtime for Hitler number, it's like you're going, huh? It was very much like that. But it's interesting and it's fun. And I've read about it a little bit. I haven't actually seen it, so I put that qualifier, but I've read about it a little bit. It's interesting. First of all, it's what's called a burlesque. Now, I'm not talking about burlesque in the sense of like, striptease and that kind of stuff. This actually goes farther back than that. In some ways, it goes back to the Romans, I guess, and Shakespeare, people like that. But in Jewish terms, probably goes back to Offenbach, who was the great Jewish composer of operettas in Paris in the 1860s, who would take mythological characters and then just spoof them like crazy in his shows. It's an old Jewish tradition. And then when you get to in America, look at around 1900. Weber and Fields were two of the biggest stars on Broadway. Two Jewish guys. They grew up together, a few blocks from each other. They were raised in New York City, and they were vaudeville stars. One was very tall and thin, the other was short and round, and sort of almost like the Three Stooges. They would punch each other and so on and so forth. And they spoke in what was called Dutch dialect. They're called Dutch dialect comics, which actually was Yiddish, and pretend they couldn't understand the language, this kind of thing. They were the biggest stars at the turn of the century, meaning 1900. And they had their own theater. And every year or so, they would do a brand new show. And they had the biggest stars on Broadway, and they paid them the best. Most prominent was probably Lillian Russell, who was kind of like the Elizabeth Taylor of her day, and they would do a show every year, and it was a parody. Some of this goes back also to minstrel shows. Forgive me, I know the blackface stuff is controversial, but they would often do a parody of I'm not talking about Weber and Fields for a second. I'm saying minstrels would often have parodies of shows in the middle too. But Weber and Fields absolutely did this. And again, it's an old Jewish tradition. So for example, in 1896, I think it was, Edmond Rostand, the great French playwright, wrote one of the great classics of the theater. You can't say theater, you have to say theater, called Cyrano de Bergerac, about a romantic 17th century duelist who was a great romantic who dies near the end and had a large beak of a nose and loved his Roxanne. Also, well, they have to respond to this, right? So they do their version. What do they call it? They call it Cyrano de Bric-en-Brac, because bric-a-brac is kind of like what, tchotchkes, you know? So it's called Cyrano tchotchkes, you know? So this notion, and I say that in particular because what they're calling this is Schmigadoon, which of course is the Yiddish SCH, like Schlemiel and Schlemazel start. They could have called it anything. They could have called it, you know, I don't know, My Fair Musical. I don't know. We talked about it before, you know. But the fact that they use the SCH at the start of this indicates a familiarity with Jewish identity and Jewish culture. Now, whether that's on the part of the people who created this or the producers or who paid for it, I don't know. I haven't investigated it. But I think there's another side to it, and that's this. One of the hallmarks of Jewish parody, I think, is affection.
Mm.
It's not mean, you know. Even Mel Brooks parodying Adolf Hitler does it by calling him Adolf Elizabeth Hitler. You know, there's a wit, there's a popping of power, there's a popping of the bubble to make it, to not make it so scary and make it, you know, like a little balloon go to nothing, shrivel to nothing. And I think that's in this as well. And, you know, and it's not to say other people haven't done so, but again, the specific use of elements from recognizable shows and parodying them with intelligence and wit and kindness, I think of being Jewish. So someone is happy to argue with me, that'd be fun. But I think there's something to that. And of course, it's fascinating also that the couple that happened to wander into this, dare I say, Schmigadoon, magical land. Lovely question. Thank you.
That's so interesting, Stuart. I'm going to sit and listen to you all day, but but I think we should probably wrap this up. Would you like to close us out with a song?
Oh my gosh. I just want to see if there's anything else in my notes from the other day. You did such a good job. I mean, my goodness gracious. I say one more interesting thing. Someone's asked about a Jewish Broadway in the audience. I think that's really the most important question of all these, not to take anything away from anybody. In my book, we talk about how part of the reason why you ended up with Jews on Broadway and all these Jewish shows and composers is because you had a Jewish audience. It was an assimilated audience. The ones I said about who were in Yiddish theater who then went over to Broadway. So by the 1930s, the Broadway audience was heavily Jewish. The New York Musicians Union was almost entirely Jewish. So that's one reason you could start having Jewish characters on shows and Jewish themes, even if they were not overt, even if they were secondary characters. It started to come in more and more too. So that's a big part of the story. And then you say, well, what happened? Because this person asked about it, you know, was it out of dominant emerging culture? Will New York always be Jewish per se? It's a lovely question. And I'll say there's a couple of very quick things. You know, Broadway's changed over the years many, many ways. The peak of the Jewish Broadway probably was the 1950s and 60s, the so-called golden age, you know. And it really peaks in my mind with Fiddler on the Roof. I think that's why Fiddler is so important as a show, in addition to being, I mean, Joel Gray's version, the Yiddish theater version they just did was just gorgeous and beautiful. I admit I cried the last 10, 15 minutes of that, even though I know the show backwards and forward. And I don't speak Yiddish, but there was something extraordinary about it. So absolutely. But, you know, the truth is that starting, you know, what happened to the Borscht Belt? Just passed away.
So
Jackie
sad.
does start, I know, in the Borscht Belt. What is that?
Yeah.
That was in the Poconos. Why? Because it was hot in New York City and everybody went to the mountains for the summer. And they would have summer camps, and there were Jewish summer camps because Jews were not allowed in so many places, you know. And a lot of comics and plays and shows and composers and so on and so forth came out of that. So what happened to that? What happened to that? Because you go there now, they're like dinosaurs. The bones are there, but there's no more old Grossingers is gone. You know, it's sad, but that's the truth. Well, what happened? What happened, from what I could tell from my research, is that the world opened up, as I said, around the 1960s to ethnicity. There used to be quotas, if you know, on Jews, number of Jews who would be admitted to any school, for example. Suddenly around 1960, this all opened up. So that's exciting and wonderful as a plus. But the downside was suddenly, as a Jewish person, you want to go on vacation? You could go anywhere. You could hop the plane and you can go to Bermuda, you can go to Hawaii, you can go to Timbuktu, because if you had the resources to do so. The restrictions were pretty much gone. Jews suddenly were white. And as a result, there was no function anymore, really, for the Borscht Belt. And I think the same thing sort of goes with Broadway. And I think Broadway also in its golden age was very much the story about that a certain generation, my parents' generation of Jews, they were born around 1917, 19, who were Americanized and were assimilated. They knew they were Jews and survived World War II, but we're very much like, hey, we're upwardly mobile and we're gaining success and acceptance and everything seems to be looking up. But the Broadway musical was a formula for how to fit in and how to succeed in America. That's what I write about. That's my thesis. Well, if you've already, that generation starts to wane after the 60s, and their kids come along who aren't interested. I mean, some of them are interested in Jewish identity, but a lot more of them are interested in Elvis Presley and the Beatles and the civil rights movement. It used to be, oh, let's have strikes and against wages and anti-Semitism, and now it's like for Black people. So instead of looking at your own people, the irony is you have more rights, and suddenly, instead of looking to yourself, people are, Jewish people of a certain generation start looking the whole wide world and saying, well, all this was things that matter to us. Let's have justice. Let's have justice in Bosnia, which is wonderful. But, but of course, what about Israel? And what about America? And what about the anti-Semitism growing the last few years here and so on? And it's, I think, a wake-up call to a number of people who thought, oh, we're fine. What do you mean there's an issue here? Or, hey, I may, other people, well, I'm not Jewish. I mean, yes, I was born Jewish. My parents went to a shul, but I decided I don't identify as Jewish. Well, that's great. What about the other person? Are they going to share your thought? Will they hit you over the head? Because you are. That's kind of what happened in Nazi Germany, folks. They, oh, well, my great grandparent, I had one, it was like, that's what Showboat's about, where you had, if you had a Black person, had one of 8 and grandparents, whatever it was, who was Black, you were Black. You had Black blood in you. And it's the same thing that the Nazis did. Oh, you're Jewish, you have one relative who is Jewish, guess what? You're a Jew. I don't care what you say. So, it's a very interesting shift we've gone through. And now we're another generation, almost yet another generation now, in search of who are we? And then, of course, one more thing, the paradox or the dilemma, and of course, in other things too, like all the Jews everybody moved out of New York City to the suburbs. It used to be people would take the streetcar to go see shows on Broadway. It was cheap, but they all moved to the suburbs. And so it was a New York audience. And then it became a tourist audience, and it still is. In fact, it's not only a tourist audience, it's now a teenage tourist audience, because that's where the money is. So, it's like that has led, the business side has led, and maybe it's always going to be that way. That's the nature of the world. And it's very fascinating, therefore, that you get something like Schmigadoon being broadcast nationally as a show that might have been in New York before, but now it's going to be seen as somehow even acceptable nationally. Or something like Monty Python's, what was the Holy Grail, which opens up, if you're going to do a musical, you need a Jew. And people laughing, and they're not laughing mean. They're saying, oh yeah, that's true. It's like it's being so woven into the fabric or accepted, and yet there's a paradox, which is yes and no. And that's the dilemma. Those are the horns of the dilemma. So read my book on musicals, and there's stuff in there about all these kinds of issues. So did I answer?
Then, Stuart, thank you. And we will all have to watch your PBS special. We will all have to read your book. And then when there's more questions, we can do another round.
Well, I really, as I said, I really appreciate that J-Arts is doing this. And I really appreciate, Laura, your efforts to get word out about the wonderful people and work that's being done in so many ways, yes, in Boston and beyond, that are so not only preserving, but sparking interest and sparking new work and new ways of expressing. This is an enormously important and wonderful endeavor that you've been working on. And I applaud you, and I applaud J Arts for its contributions, which I hope will continue and continue and continue.
Well, thank you, Stuart. And I think it's all about the historic roots and bringing it into today. So everything you've said is so just spot on with the J Arts mission and vision and who we are. So it's wonderful to work with you and have you on our leadership team, and to be continued. Thank you so much.